Hello and welcome back to the Vicarage here at St Francis of Assisi, Mere Heath, and to our spring course on evil and suffering. Last week we gave a brief introduction to the problem, which is fundamentally existential, affecting us all at the root of our lives and having the most profound implications for our faith in God. This week we'll be considering the responses to be found to the problem within the pages of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. Although we can do no more in the time we have available than sketch the outline of Jewish responses, I hope you'll profit from this, at least in coming to understand more fully the depth of the challenges the question of the existence of suffering and evil poses. If, as Christians, we are to consider the whole question of theodicy, of reconciling the existence of evil in all its forms with the existence of God, and particularly with the loving God of Christian faith, then we cannot do without consideration of how the ancient people of the Bible, the Hebrews, who later became the Jews, reacted to the problem. However, it'd be a grave mistake to think that there's only one single approach or answer within that tradition. But not only did the Bible develop over the course of 1,000 years and more, but also at any given time there were different responses, as the biblical record itself makes clear. Moreover, the response of the biblical people of God cannot easily be understood without at least a cursory look at how people in the wider world reacted to the same problem. The Israelite response did not arise out of a vacuum, however different a course it was bound to take. Crucial to the development of the Hebrew approach, if it can be termed that, was its understanding of the divine nature of the one God, something which depended on God's self-revelation and which was necessarily lacking elsewhere. In a sense, the ancient peoples outside of Israel, and to an extent Greece, had no problem with the question. The spiritual world was populated by a whole panoply of gods and semi-divine beings who were essentially indifferent to the human race, but whose favour could be gained or even purchased through the transaction, though the transactional currency for this purchase would vary from sacrifice through financial bribery to acts of valour. Appeasement of the gods by these means would probably ensure, if not absolutely guarantee, the favour of the deities in worldly terms, whilst failure to ensure payment of proper attention to their gods and their requirements would lead, in all probability, to expressions of their righteous anger through the sending of manifold calamities upon humans. The world was also populated by malign spirits who sought humanity's harm, and these had to be warded off through a combination of appeasement, counter curses, and the patronage of more powerful deities, purchased through the means we've already mentioned. It was accepted that life was a chancy business. There were no guarantees of success or safety, and the negative experiences of life, evil as we may term them, were the direct consequences of failing to adequately satisfy the varying and often conflicting demands of the gods. This was in the main just accepted as a given. Some exceptions to this understanding of the problem may be found in the thought world of Greece and of Athens in particular. Whilst the early Greeks certainly shared this view that we've mentioned, and even in much later Greek thinking among the less philosophically inclined, it was still evident more sophisticated Greeks came to reject it. It doesn't mean that they arrived at any universally accepted solution, but at least they were fully aware of the problem, and among the more educated men, there was a willingness to grapple with the problem. This can be best seen through the writings of Plato, who lived circa 428 to 348 BC. Plato, arguably the greatest of the Greek philosophers, was alive to the problem of the seeming existence of evil alongside the undeniable existence and goodness of God, although he nowhere deals systematically with the problem. He does, in his book The Republic, seem to indicate that suffering and evil are punishments for sins committed in a former life, or, if not, then they occur as pedagogic tools designed to teach a man in such a way that they, although not properly understood by us, work to bring about man's ultimate good. As we shall see, this latter idea is similar to certain strands of Hebrew thought, from which the idea of suffering and evil as retribution for acts carried out in this world, in this life, is far from absent. Now, although the Hebrews did not in general share the unmitigated polytheism of their neighbours, but were in fact rather henotheists, that is, they saw their God as being the supreme God in some sense, at the very least locally, they did share at least some of the assumptions of their pagan neighbours. Although Yahweh was supreme, and therefore was not pitted against competing deities or malignant spirits, nevertheless, man had to buy God's favour through sacrifice, yes, but also, and chiefly, through obedience to his laws and commandments. Always present, there could at times appear to be at least a tension, if not a direct conflict, between these two demands. This may clearly be seen at work in the account we find in Genesis 22 of Abraham being required by God to sacrifice Isaac, his son. Although it would seem initially that God's favour is to be bought, it is actually through obedience to God's righteous commands that Abraham wins God's approval. We're not told that story would have happened had God not instructed Abraham to desist from the sacrifice. But under this is the age-old question posited by the Greek Plato in his dialogue, the Euphyphro, is what is commanded by God good because he commands it, or is what God commands good because it's moral aside from God, and therefore he commands it? It's a thorny question we shall, in a later talk, return to. The early Hebrew tradition saw one's place in the world as being dependent upon the larger whole. The individual mattered not so much as an individual, but as a member of a whole, the whole being the family, tribe, or nation. This permitted or even compelled them to see the trials and tribulations of life in a wider context. Of course, if one failed to obey God's commandments, one might be punished individually. Thus, we see in Genesis 4 that Cain is punished by being driven out of his home and banished to the land of the men of Nod, because he personally slew his brother. The punishment falls on the head of the wrongdoer. However, that's not always the case. Frequently, we find that punishment afflicts the children of the sinner, their descendants, or members of the wider family circle, or even of the nation, although they may be personally innocent of any crime. And indeed, very often, it's the king who sums up in himself the whole nation who sins, but it's the nation who suffers the consequences. To the early Hebrews, with their intense awareness of the corporate, something which remains, albeit in a different way, important to Christianity, this was not problematic. Indeed, blessings could just as easily bestowed in the same way. This sense of the corporate retains decisive importance throughout much of the Old Testament era, though there was an increasing awareness that it could not, of itself, provide an adequate response to the cry, "Why me?" Now, gradually, although the sense of the corporate never disappeared from Jewish thought, and indeed persists to this day as it does in Christianity, the individual began to gain primacy in his or her own right. No longer could suffering be answered by reference to the sin of the parents or of the wider body to which the individual belonged, although we do find that attitude persisting even in the pages of the Gospels. Rather, guilt and punishment were increasingly seen as being the due owing to the individual for their sin and their sin alone. Responsibility was thus seen as being purely, or at least largely, placed on the shoulders of the individual person. This re-emphasizing of a strand which had always been present served to answer one problem, but at the same time raised a different problem, or raised an old problem in a new form. What it was asked was the reason for the suffering of the innocent, of the righteous or godly. Now, this question is present in other parts of the Old Testament, notably, for example, in Jeremiah, where the author raises this matter a number of times. It is in Job that we find the question raised in a heightened form. Job's erstwhile friends are convinced that he suffers because he, Job, has secretly or even unknowingly sinned, despite his protestations of innocence. Job's repeated assertions of his innocence lead to his demanding of God a reason for his seemingly unjust punishment. Now, although we don't here have the time to delve in any depth into the question, there is ultimately a sort of resolution in finding in suffering an educative function, similar to Plato's suggestion. Somehow, in spite of appearances to the contrary, suffering serves a valuable purpose for the individual, leading to a growth in character which will somehow bear fruit, if not in this life, then in a future destiny, although not a life in this world. For the early Hebrews, unlike for the nations around them, there was no real conception of life after death. All people would, on death, enter the vague shadow world of Sheol, where the soul would continue to exist in disembodied life for just so long as they were remembered on earth. As their memory ceased here, so the soul would gradually fade out into non-existence. This was the primary reason why so much stress was placed on being remembered after death. Reward for obedience to God's laws and commands was understood as being found in the manifold blessings bestowed by God in this world: children, riches, honour, health, and length of life. The choice of life or death, repeatedly given to Israel, was conceived solely in earthly terms. Whilst obedience would bring blessings, disobedience would incur divine displeasure, manifested through poverty, barrenness, contempt, disease, and untimely death. This form of divine retribution made manifest sense to early Hebrews, and it was only as their history progressed that events and reality caused a radical questioning of this in the minds of a number, some of whose writings count among the finest pieces of biblical writing. It was rapid societal changes as much as the perceived suffering of the genuinely righteous, which led to a marked reappraisal of the earlier understanding of the retributive nature of suffering, not least owing to deeper and more frequent contact with other lines of thinking from beyond Israel. Those who thought deeply about these things began to see the necessity of life beyond this world and a divine judgment for each individual. Resisted even at the time of Christ by the conservative Sadducees though it was, this idea of the eternity of the human person became a hallmark of later Jewish spirituality and theological awareness. Given that God is indeed just, and given that in this world it is an undisputed fact that the good often suffer whilst the wicked prosper, it became a theological imperative that there be a future life when God would act to right the injustices of the world and punish those who in this world had disobeyed his commandments. Nothing else could satisfy the concept of a just God. The divine command to choose life or death was thus given a new impetus in the eternal nature of that choice. And although we've only had the time to briefly scratch the surface of Israel's responses to the problem of evil and suffering, and it's actually a vast topic, we've at least been able to recognize that there was no single solution to the problem, but rather a range of responses which varied in the degree of satisfaction they could offer. Even when considering as educative or as being in some sense helpful to the individual for the purposes of eternal life, problems with the existence of evil and suffering remain. At the very least, what is there to be said of appalling suffering when no educative, beneficial outcome seems possible? What of the suffering of even babes in arms? And perhaps it's no surprise then that in some strands of later Jewish speculative thought, consideration will be given to the possibility of some sort of reincarnation as providing a solution to the problem. However, that approach was to remain very much a minority one. For the most part, Judaism was forced into the position of affirming that God, being both holy and just, would be faithful to his promises. Somehow it was felt God's almighty power and absolute knowledge would ensure that in spite of appearances, there would be value in suffering, that somehow he would make it possible that all this evil in a world created fundamentally good would have a redemptive purpose. Although the suffering servant of the anonymous writer of the second part of Isaiah is usually considered by Jews as representing the corporate body of Israel, prior to the Christian identification of him with Jesus, it was not uncommon to consider him as an individual. Some were so daring as to see in the sufferings of the servants, in ways in which are unclear, some sort of redemptive character, if only through example, though a few went further than this. In this view, suffering itself had not just an educative function for both the individual and the nation, but also an essential and redemptive nature through which the promises of God would be made good. We might not be able to understand the existence of evil, of suffering, but we could, through patient faith, come to attain their fullness. At the end of the day, Israel's lived experience of God and his faithfulness throughout the history of the people and through his gracious favour shown to individuals were the guarantee that in God's good time and beyond this world, to use the words of a much later Christian mystic, all will be well, and all will be well, and all manner of things will be well. At the end of the day, in the face of so much suffering, and in the lived conviction and experience of God's power and goodness, perhaps this cry of faith is the fullest, most adequate response which we can make. Next week, we'll turn in some detail to the responses of one of the greatest Christian thinkers, and in the following week, of one lesser known perhaps, but still important, especially in his own day. We'll try and tackle these profound responses before, in our final session, we consider the role of Jesus and suffering and evil. Thanks very much for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed this and found it informative. It is only touching on the subject, but at least gives an outline of some approaches to the problem. Please do consider subscribing to our channel and join us again next week for the next instalment of this course. Good night.